That period that we built Kings Island was the great proliferation of parks in the United States. There were more theme parks built in the 70s than any other period before or since.
I want to move Coney Island. I want Taft Broadcasting to buy it. We'll build a new theme park together. We'll incorporate Hanna-Barbera. I was going to have a showdown board meeting within the Coney Island Company about moving this park. Firm again, he said, are you sure you want to do this? And I said, absolutely.
On July 4th, 1972, it was like somebody turned on the spigot. A huge reservoir opened up and people started pouring in. And they poured in and they poured in every day for the remainder of the 1972 season. We were averaging 25 to 30,000 people a day. It was unbelievable, the number of people.
The people who came up in the beginning, they paid their money and they walked through there, and I'll tell you, it was just fun to stand there. Their jaws dropped.
When we came back, we were all absolutely white and scared to death. And we said, what did we create?
For nearly 40 years, Kings Island, located 20 miles north of Cincinnati, Ohio, has been a popular destination for families and thrill seekers alike. Hello, I'm Nate Byram, and today, CET is taking you on a special behind-the-scenes look at Cincinnati's favorite amusement park. Join me as we reveal some hidden history and relive some fond memories of Kings Island. To tell the story of Kings Island, I had to find the man who started it all. And my search led me to the general manager of Garfield Suites Hotel in downtown Cincinnati. I was going to meet the father of Kings Island.
My name is Gary Wachs. I was general manager at Kings Island from its inception, going back to 1970 under construction. And I was there through its first season, 72, and then I moved to Richmond, Virginia to build another park, the sister park, Kings Dominion. I started at Coney Island as a young man of 25 years of age in 1961, and my family was involved with the park. And I worked there till 1964 and witnessed a few floods. But in 64, we had the fourth highest flood in history. It was 66.6 feet. There was the Great Flood of 37. There was a big flood in 1913 and one in 1945. This was the fourth highest. And it was a horrible flood. It did a lot of destruction to Coney Island. And as a young man at the time, I guess youth looks way down the road instead of right around the corner. And I was thinking, what future does Coney Island really have with floods like this? That turned my mindset for the rest of my life. After that, I probably spent half my time thinking about how to move that park and the other half how to operate the park. In my opinion, Kings Island was literally conceived in 1964 because I devoted a great deal of time trying to figure out a way to move Coney Island to another location. And I spent the better part of, let's see, that was 64. We merged with the Taft Broadcasting Company in July of 69. So I spent almost 5 years preparing for the day when we could build a Kings Island type park. And I did a lot of work. I wrote almost a thesis on it. I traveled extensively. I figured out what we wanted to do for the concept of Kings Island, what is popular. I visited every amusement park in the country. I traveled to Europe in 1963. And I saw many things that left me with an impression of how to design the concept for Kings Island. So we literally had the concept for Kings Island. It wasn't called Kings Island then. We didn't have a name for this. But I had a concept for that park before we ever merged with the Taft Broadcasting Company. So the story of the merger is interesting, but when we did merge, we were ready to go. You know, it was fascinating in those days because when we got in bed with Taft, Taft essentially threw the keys at me and said, go build it. And I knew I had to hire a couple of guys and say, here are the keys, you do it. And Jack Rouse is one. I threw the keys at him. We need a live show department, and he did it. This other guy said, we need a merchandising department, and he did it.
Well, so Gary threw the keys, and, you know, I caught the keys, and then it was kind of important that I find somebody to do it with me because I wasn't all that talented. So I threw part of the keys anyway to a guy named Carmen De Leon, who, of course, still is here in Cincinnati, and we sort of took off from there.
It was a wonderful opportunity for a lot of young men, including Mr. Spiegel. He worked at the front gate at Coney Island as a seasonal employee. And I used to ask him, what would you like to do in your life? And he said, well, I'm going to be a teacher at Amelia High School. Well, about a year later, when Kings Island came up, it was kind of like World War II. We had a lot of planes to fly, but we didn't have enough pilots. And I had to hire a bunch of pilots in a hurry. So I saw Denny, and he certainly looked like a energetic, smart young guy. And I said, how would you like to get in this business? And I said, several of us have to go up to Kings Island and start working on this park, but we don't have enough people to stay at Coney Island to help run Coney Island. So he jumped at it, and he was a great fit. He was just a natural in the business. And he went up the ladder pretty quickly because as soon as I got through with Kings Island, I was only the general manager there for the first season, because then I had to move out of town to Richmond, Virginia to build King's Dominion. So it was an opportunity for Denny. It was an opportunity for a lot of young men. It was really, really great.
So Gary Wachs was the father of Kings Island. I guess that would make Dennis Spiegel, the president of International Theme Park Services, the fun-loving uncle of Kings Island.
I worked at Coney Island from junior high school through college. When I graduated from college, I became part of the management team at Coney Island, and that evolved into a position of full-time employment at Kings Island when we opened in 1972. Well, Kings Island was very interesting because it was really the beginning of the industry. It came at that point. There weren't many theme parks at that point in time, with the exception of Disneyland and a couple of other properties out in California. There were only 2 other Six Flags parks at that time, and we began planning Kings Island, realizing that Coney Island, our existing park, couldn't grow. We needed a bigger facility for this market. It was landlocked. We had the river on the south side of Coney Island. We had Route 52 on the north side. We had the River Downs Racetrack on the east side, and the little town of California on the west side. So we only had 155 acres at Coney Island. It was pretty well maxed out at that time.
For a long time, I had to solve some internal problems within Coney Island about moving. Number one, I was a young maverick that wanted to move a park that was extremely successful. We were voted time and time again as the world's finest amusement park, the #1 amusement park. This was before the advent of theme parks. But we really were the finest amusement park in the country by all of our peers' definition. And for a young man like me to run around even within our own organization and say, let's get out of here, when we were very, very successful, I wasn't taken terribly seriously in those days. And I finally won over a few people in the organization, and even my father, who I loved and adored, but he was sort of in the middle of the road. I think in his heart he knew I was right, because competition was coming. We couldn't stand the floods. But he was of an age where I don't think he wanted to be a pioneer in this effort. So we had another person in the company. He was not a majority stockholder. He was a significant stockholder, and his name was Charles Sawyer. He was Secretary of Commerce under Truman. He was ambassador to Belgium in World War II. He was quite an interesting man. He was a senior partner of Taft, Stettinius, and Hollister. He was a very very supportive guy in everything we did. He never interfered with the management of Coney Island because, frankly, he was in Washington and Europe most of the time. Very supportive until I wanted to move this park. So I started making presentations to him, trying to sell him on the idea. I even flew him down to Six Flags over Georgia the year it opened in 1967 to show him what a modern theme park was and what we were going to be facing in our area sooner or later if we didn't move. Well, I couldn't get him to budge. He was in his 80s, and as I said earlier, a young man looks way down the road, an old man barely looks around the corner. So I couldn't get him to budge on the idea, and I was kind of frustrated. And then push came to shove, and I decided to have a Coney Island Board of Directors meeting. And frankly, I had lined up all of the stockholders. And between some friends and family, we had the majority control of the stock. And here I was again as a young man, I was going to have a showdown board meeting within the Coney Island Company about moving this park. And I thought, boy, oh boy, I've got to go up against Mr. Sawyer when he's already told me he doesn't like the idea. And this would have been a classic board meeting. But you know what? It never happened. And why didn't it ever happen? Because all of a sudden, what I had been preaching for a long time, we had such a marvelous market area. We were a wagon wheel city, I called it. We were Cincinnati in the middle of Indianapolis and Dayton and Lexington and Louisville and Columbus. None of these cities had any entertainment, any amusement parks. And we had drawn from those markets very well at Coney Island. So I knew if we had a major theme park, it would be an outstanding market area. Well, some people on the West Coast had the same idea. They had spotted this market area, and it was a guy named Fess Parker who was a big television star in those days. He had that Western series on television, and lo and behold, I wake up one morning, and the Enquirer has a headline. It said, Fess Parker to build a theme park. And it was in northern Kentucky at the confluence of I-71 and I-75. And my heart sank because I knew this was for real. I knew this was going to happen. I knew some of the people he had behind him. I knew he used a company called Economic Research Association, which was a major player in those days. And they had crunched all the numbers. And all of a sudden, I went from a kid who was not taking terribly serious to overnight, I had instant credibility because I had been predicting this stuff for 5 years. So he really shook things up, and frankly, I had a pit in the bottom of my stomach because I knew this was going to happen. And I knew instantly that Coney Island was going to go from the world's finest amusement park to one of two things. A second-rate park like La Swordsville, which I didn't want to be a part of. Neither did the staff of Coney Island want to be a part of, or it would have put Coney Island out of business. Coincidentally, Coney Island in 1967 or 8, we were having the WKRC Pops concerts in Moonlight Gardens. Arthur Fiedler was there, people of that stature. They were on Sunday afternoon, and they were absolutely wonderful. And because Taft Broadcasting owned KRC, some of the officials from the corporate office would come up to Moonlight Gardens and watch these Pops concerts. And one day I was up there, and I had met the president of Taft Broadcasting, Lawrence Rogers, and got to know him a little bit. And I decided, because of making that acquaintance and knowing Taft Broadcasting had recently acquired Hanna-Barbera, I was going to take a flyer, knock on his door, take my presentation over to him and see if he wanted to get in the amusement park business. Buy Coney Island, we'll build the park, Taft put up the money. So I told my father I was going to go do this, and he said, call him. So I called Bud Rogers, and Bud had no idea what was on my mind. I think he was probably thinking I was going to make a United Appeal call or something of that nature. And he said, sure, come come over, and I had packed my valise. I had all these materials, all this presentation stuff. I had everything from renderings to concepts to pro formas to market studies. This was the same presentation I had given Mr. Sawyer for 2 hours, not to mention people within our own organization. So I go see Bud Rogers. It was, this was 68, late 1968. I go in his office, and I'll never forget, I walked in his office, and he was on the phone, and it was a conference call, and he was giving an editorial to all of Taft stations across the country, and I guess they did that in some fashion in those days, an editorial from the corporate office. And he was on the phone, and he kind of motioned to me, come on in, and I'm dragging this big valise of materials in, and he had absolutely no idea what I was doing there. He hung up, and he said, he was very gracious. He said, now what can I do for you? And I said, Bud, I'm going to need an hour of your time. And he looked at me and he said, well, that's all right. So I opened this material up and I said, Bud, I want to move Coney Island. I want Taft Broadcasting to buy it. We'll build a new theme park together. We'll incorporate Hanna-Barbera. And here's the rationale behind it. And I proceeded to go through all this stuff again, which I'd gone through so many times. I was pretty good at it at that point. I could do it with my eyes closed. And after I was through, he was really sort of nonplussed, because again, he didn't know why I was coming over there. And he said, he paused and he said, very interesting. And he said, let me think about this, talk about this, and I'll call you. And I left his office, and I told my father about the visit, and I said, Dad, I think there's some interest there, but Bud's going to call me. So he did. He called me a couple of weeks later, and we had lunch at the Palm Court in the old Netherland Hotel, and this was over the Christmas holidays. And he kind of reaffirmed again. He said, are you sure you want to do this? And I said, absolutely. He said, are you and your father on the same page? My father was president of Coney Island at that time. And I said, we absolutely are. And he said, well, we have one more meeting. I want you to meet Mr. Meacham, who is the new chairman of the board at Taft Broadcasting, and I'm going to set up a lunch at the Masonette. Well, a week or two later, we did that, and I met Mr. Meacham at the Masonette, and I remember, among other things, I took over some stock performance statistics from the Great Southwest Corporation, which at the time owned all of the Six Flags theme parks. And of course, the stock was going straight up. And I showed that to Mr. Meacham and how it was possible to do the same thing. And in my opinion, I think the vaccination took at that luncheon. At the end of that luncheon, Mr. Meacham asked me, he said, how about Mr. Sawyer? Because he had worked with Mr. Sawyer in the Taft law firm before he switched over and became chairman of the board at Taft Broadcasting. He said, where are you with Mr. Sawyer? And I said, well, quite frankly, Mr. Sawyer is not aware of this meeting. And I explained to him my history with Mr. Sawyer, and he had been opposed to this, but I also said, I think he's very approachable now because his stock is threatened by Fess Parker's proposed investment. So I would think there would be a big change of heart. But I wanted to talk to you all first to see if you were willing to go along with this, and then I was going to go back and talk to him. Well, Mr. Meacham said, let me talk to him. I know him quite well. I think I can convince him. And he did. And the next thing I knew, I got a call from Mr. Sawyer, and his mind had totally changed. He said, let's get on with this project. Come down to my office. I want to make some phone calls to some banks because we've got to stop this Fess Parker right away. We have to stop this man from getting his financing. So I got downtown to Mr. Sawyer's office, and it was really kind of fascinating because he was a very interesting, influential man. To make a long story short, we shut down that project. Fess Parker could not get financing. And not too long after that, we announced the merger of Coney Island and Taft Broadcasting. That was July of 1969. And when we announced that merger, the next day, I ceased doing everything operationally I ever did at Coney Island, and I devoted 18 hours a day to starting Kings Island.
Gary Wachs was the young man who was really promoting this idea within the family. And it was interesting at that time, Taft Broadcasting Company, which was a well-known company here in Cincinnati, had, which owned television and radio stations, Channel 12, WKRC, was looking to expand. They had just bought Hanna-Barbera Productions, which was Fred Flintstone, Barney Rubble, Yogi Bear, Scooby-Doo, and they were looking for a way to exploit those characters.
I and my associates were looking for ways to broaden Hanna-Barbera's scope from just cartoons. And one of the obvious roadmaps was what Disney had done based on their cartoon empire. And, of course, amusement parks were a very important part of that.
And the president and chairman of that company flew out to California and had a meeting with Roy Disney.
After we approached Taft Broadcasting, and they seemed to like the idea of buying Coney Island and starting a theme park because of their connection with Hanna-Barbera, then they went out to see the Disney group to kind of check out Coney Island, to see if these guys were for real. Even though we were in Cincinnati, we didn't know each other that well.
Following up on that, had a luncheon meeting with Roy Disney, who was Walt Disney's brother. Walt was dead. Roy Disney was sort of the business brains of the operation, and talked to Roy Disney about whether going into the amusement park business was a smart thing. And he spent quite a bit of time on the subject. The lunch lasted, several hours. But at the end of the luncheon, it was very funny because he said, I can't help but laugh that you're out here in Los Angeles talking to me about the amusement park business, because the finest small amusement park in America is right in your hometown, Coney Island.
Interestingly enough, in 1953, Walt came to Cincinnati to consult with my father and uncle, who ran the park at the time, and were among the very few people in the country that supported him in his venture. Most people didn't think he had a chance. They didn't understand what he was trying to do. My father and uncle backed him totally. They went out to Los Angeles. So it's a long story, but I think ever since those days, Coney Island had a place in its heart in the Disney group. And I think the Taft officials found that out when they went out there.
Well, the two came together, the families and Taft Broadcasting Company, and the deal was put together, and it was over and merged in about 6 months.